Welcome and thank you for joining me today on the From Moses to Mookie podcast. Today we are going to talk about one of the main reasons behind Major League Baseball's declining black population. If you remember from the last episode, and I'll mention these stats again in further episodes, in 1984, black players represented 18.4% of the league. That's a pretty sizable portion, but in 2016, the representation dropped to 6.7%. I think there are really several reasons for this, and we're going to get into one of these today. And to talk about it, I'm going to introduce a little bit of a story. When I was growing up, I live in Greensboro, North Carolina. My parents moved there when we were kids. We've been here for 10, 11, 12 years or so. And one of our favorite things to do as a kid, and even now, is we like to go to the minor league baseball games in downtown Greensboro. Our dad conveniently works about a mile or so, mile and a half maybe, from the ballpark just outside of downtown. When we were kids, obviously we couldn't drive. I was like 8, my brother was like 6, so we weren't going to be able to drive to the park. We didn't have bikes because we wouldn't have brought them with us to Dad's office. We would just walk to the ball games. We would buy our tickets. We would take our tickets. We'd put on sunscreen. We'd grab our ball gloves, and we would walk from Dad's office about a mile and a half towards the stadium. If we got hungry, we might stop around at a business, or if we were older and we wanted to, we could go into a shop if we had money to spend, of course. We could go to the park. We could go anywhere else, and then we would go to the ball game, or we could do any of those things afterwards. That's a pretty common setup for baseball stadiums or any really professional stadium that's located in a downtown area. You've got a whole bunch of surrounding stuff, barbershops, grocery stores, restaurants, you name it, it's got it. And this was no different back in the 1980s when baseball among black people was extremely popular, whether it was during the Jackie Robinson era of the 1940s and 1950s, or in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, when Negro League baseball was a major thing. And I think that's one of the things that has really led to some of the decline in baseball's popularity among the black community. There were plenty of teams in the Negro Leagues. It wasn't like a niche community either. There were over 20 teams from 1920s until the 1940s when it really started to decline, and then when it really folded in the 1960s. But there were a lot of teams, and it wasn't just in the Northeast. It wasn't just in the South. You had teams from St. Louis, from New York, from Cleveland, from Atlanta. You had all sorts of Negro League baseball teams across the area. So it wasn't like the Negro Leagues were a niche interest. There was enough demand for baseball among the black community that 26 organizations were founded, not necessarily in 26 different cities, but across the eastern U.S. Something to remember about it is that these did not come up by choice. The Negro Leagues were a result of segregation, of the Jim Crow policy, of the separate but equal policy. You saw that blacks were not welcomed into the major leagues because of gentlemen's agreements between owners and general managers. It was just not allowed until Jackie Robinson came in 1947. So black people during segregation, not just during baseball, but during segregation in general, were excluded from communities that were predominantly white, meaning they could not go to the grocery store with their white neighbors. They could not go to church or to school or get their hair cut at the same place or shop at the same stores. They couldn't do anything like that. They had a couple of different options. They could either accept these conditions and choose to do their grocery shopping out of the back of the grocery stores, which was not uncommon, or to go to the back of restaurants to be served, or to sit in the back of the bus. There were a variety of options that black people could have chosen if they wanted to just accept these conditions. However, they also had the option to resist. And one of the forms of resistance, besides the protests, besides the marches, besides the rising up and the fighting for their rights, as advocated by either Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr., one of the ways that they did this was to take black communities and invest in them. That means they would invest in the churches, invest in schools, invest in the shops, invest in grocery stores. Black-owned businesses were staples of the black community. Among those was Negro League Baseball. Negro League Baseball was supported by black fans because, one, they really had no other option, but also because it was a place where black people could go to be entertained by other black people who looked like them, who struggled like them, who had the same or a similar walk as them. This led to the Negro Leagues becoming more of a community type feel and a staple in black identity than did Major League Baseball, which is really simply just an entertainment source. Negro Leagues for black people seemed to represent a little bit more than just that. It was a pride in the fact that our black players are playing professionally. And then that transitioned later on into having pride in the black players like Jackie Robinson or Satchel Paige that eventually played in Major League Baseball. But the Negro Leagues were, because they were black owned, because they were meant for black people to participate in and then watch, there was a serious interest and a serious investment by the community in that team. So you see teams, you see players. There's one photograph of Satchel Paige in a Time magazine article where he's walking around the street and this group of probably 20 kids or so, 15, 20 kids, is following him around and hanging out with him, and they're close to him a lot. It seemed as though they were family members or as though they were just tight-knit members of the community. And that's what it really seemed like, is that the Negro Leagues, because black people had nowhere else to go, they turned to the Negro Leagues and it became a staple in the community. It seems as though the fact that the Negro Leagues were a part of the community and therefore part of the identity played a major role in the importance of baseball in that community. Let's compare that to today, when Major League Baseball doesn't really seem to be a community aspect as much as it is a business side. Let's take a quick look into, let's just go with the Yankees, because the Yankees are an easy example. The Yankees, when you think of the Yankees, at least when I think of the Yankees, you think 27 rings, you think a lot of money, you think George Steinbrenner, you think massive contracts and being able to afford a whole bunch of money. You also think New York City, the Bronx, you think of an excellent opportunity to outreach into the community, but that's not always been the case. Recently, actually, instead of keeping their prices at an affordable level, their prices have gone up. Now, part of that's because inflation, and part of it's because they have more players, and with a better quality of product, you're going to make your product more expensive. But it's not as though the Yankees are short on cash. The Yankees have a TV network that can bring in as much money and help them get any player that they want without having to up the ticket prices. So the ticket prices are excluding, because they keep on going up, they're excluding those who do not make as much money, which would include the local black kids, the local Latino kids, the local minority kids in general, whose parents may not have enough money to pay $80 to send them to a baseball game. They don't have that kind of option. Whereas in the Negro Leagues, it wasn't just you had the option and you had the affordability to go to one of these games, but it was, you're looking at guys who are going through the same things as you do. It's very hard for me to believe that Giancarlo Stanton right now is ever having to figure out where his next meal is going to come from. It doesn't seem as though Aaron Judge or Luis Severino or CC Sabathia will ever be strapped for cash. And a lot of these guys as individuals do great things for the community and for outreach programs, but the team as a whole, it's really limiting itself to one group of people, and those are who can afford it. And unfortunately, in a lot of urban areas, the minority groups are the ones who cannot afford to invest in baseball. So I think that community part is especially important in the development of a black fan base for Major League Baseball. And then from a black fan base, you can get kids who want to play the game, and you get kids who want to go to the next level and play in college. You get kids who in college who are black, they want to go play professionally. It starts with Major League Baseball, and it begins with the fact that a lot of them are caring a lot more about the business side of things than they are about the community that they reside in. So I hope that it clears up one of these factors in the reason for the black decline. It's not necessarily a direct reason, but it's one of those that it's developed over time, over 30 years, over 50 years, where community is just not as big of a priority to these teams. In the next episode, we're going to talk a little bit about how just the logistics of baseball makes it incredibly hard for those who can't afford it financially to play it, and how that impacts those in urban areas. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming up here in just a little bit.